Hi, everyone. Welcome to McNally Jackson Books. Tonight we have a panel on Bloomberg's New York. Adam Becker, professor at NYU, is going to moderate the panel and introduce our panelists tonight. Thank you so much for coming and enjoy.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, I'm not Mark Crispin Miller. If I were, I'd be far more, I guess, politically astute and eloquent. Secondly, not only that, but I'm a scholar of religion, and I work on primarily the pre-modern Middle East. So my insights are not going to be particularly useful tonight. However, I have lived in New York most of my life, and like most people who've lived all or most of their lives in New York, I feel like I'm an expert. So I'll begin with, we didn't settle on who's going to, yeah, actually we drew straws before you arrived. Julian Brash, you are a professor at Montclair State University in anthropology, and I noticed there was a piece that you wrote. It was Luxury City, and I think that was an appropriate place to start. We're going to be talking about Bloomberg's New York, and I have a feeling it's going to be a pretty critical in the common sense of the term discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the three of you have to say, because I get angry all the time, but I don't know that much, and I'm not particularly critical in this area, so I'm hoping to learn a lot from the three of you. And so we're going to go for about 40 minutes, having each of you, not for 40 minutes each, 40 minutes just speaking a bit about kind of general themes and issues that you want to address regarding this issue, and then we're going to have about 20 minutes of questions and discussion with the audience. So Julian, if you could begin, maybe just tell us about Bloomberg's New York.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for coming, and thanks to McNally Jackson and News from the Underground and Adam for having me. I'm going to just talk a little bit about...
Can you introduce the speakers, please? We don't know.
Oh, I was going to introduce each. Well, I can introduce them all at once then. Okay. Julian, Neil Fabricant, you are a emeritus professor from it was Georgetown.
George Washington.
Oh, George
University.
Washington. Sorry. You can see I just arrived here and so.
I was undergraduate faculty at Baruch in the business school,
Okay.
but I was the president of the GW Graduate School of Political Management.
Okay. Thank you. And Genie Wilkie, you are the president of the Downtown Independent Democrats.
President of Downtown Independent Democrats, and also some years ago, former chair of Community Board 2's zoning and land use committee when there was a lot of development going on downtown, not that it stopped, if anything accelerated.
Thanks. If you could begin,
Sure. I'll talk a bit about the main themes and arguments of my book, and I want to preface it by saying that I really focused on what I call the Bloomberg way, which was the mayor and his top aides' approach to governance in the early part of the Bloomberg administration, because I thought that was the time when what Bloomberg's project was most clear, before it sort of encountered the reality of New York City politics. So the picture I'm going to give you is a picture that leans towards a more kind of strong version of the project and less of one that has to accommodate itself to reality. So I'm really looking at what the Bloomberg folks were up to when they first came in, when they were most excited about transforming governance in New York City and the city itself, and what that was about. And then, as I'll talk a little bit about at the end, that didn't quite work out the way they had planned, and there's some good reasons for that, and reasons that I think are important to understand. But first of all, I want to talk about three things about the Bloomberg administration that I think are majorly misunderstood or incorrect propositions. And I think if we see how, or my interpretation of these three propositions, I think gives a sense of what I think the Bloomberg administration is all about, or has been all about. And first, the Bloomberg administration likes to present itself as non-political, as not particularly ideological. And those two things, I think, are very important. First of all, I think the Bloomberg administration is not partisan. in the same way we typically understand political, but it is certainly political, and its politics are a class politics. And one of the arguments I make throughout the book is the Bloomberg approach to urban governance is a class project. So what do I mean by that? One of the things I say often is to really understand what Bloomberg administration is about, the first thing you have to understand is it's not really just about Michael Bloomberg. It's about a larger group of people that I call the post-industrial elite. It consists of two kind of big groups. One is the really big guys, the big guns, the wealthiest people in the city, the CEOs, people like Bloomberg or Daniel Doctoroff or Andrew Alpert, two former financiers who served in his administration. But it's also about a group that's sort of slightly down the socioeconomic scale, which some people call the creative class. I call it the professional managerial class. So these are relatively well-off, well-skilled, well-trained, upper class, white-collar people in the professions. And one of the things that happened in the last 40 years is these people really found their footing in New York City. First economically, and when we look at what happened in the 70s and the 80s, and the gentrification in neighborhoods like Park Slope, and in other places throughout the city that followed that, what that was really about was this group of people who were coming into New York City because of the economic transformations that New York City had been experiencing, the move towards what's often called a post-industrial economy. These were the people who were really benefiting from that transformation. And as they moved into the city, they themselves transformed neighborhoods throughout the city. So those two groupings, I argue in the book, never really found a political footing until Mayor Bloomberg came along in 2000, 2001, and ran for mayor. And what Mayor Bloomberg really did, because of his particular kind of outlook and approach to governance and his own personal biography, sort of tied those two groups together into a political alliance. Bloomberg himself arose from not particularly humble beginnings, but he went to graduate school. He was highly respectful of professional expertise, which is something, of course, that white-collar professionals like. He made that very clear in his campaign. He had a much better sense of the cultural tastes of these people than I think Giuliani or other mayors had before him. So he was able to appeal to the people outside of just the sort of masters of the universe. And I think that class alliance is fundamental to understanding the Bloomberg administration. There are lots of details I could give about how that actually worked within City Hall, but suffice it to say that the clearest way you saw this most early on was the people who came into city government because, and this is what they said to me, because of Mayor Bloomberg. And they said, we would never, they said to me, work for a mayor unless it was one like this one. So there were lots of architects and people with MBAs and people who worked for McKinsey, professors, academics, public health professionals who came into the administration because they felt it would be a different type of administration. And this is in addition to people like Doctoroff and Alpert who were directly within the circle that Bloomberg was a part of. So that's a very important thing to note. Second of all, the approach to governance that emerged out from this group of people was a highly ideological approach to governance. It was transformative. It was incredibly ambitious. One of the things I argue in the book is that Bloomberg, unlike a lot of people who have said they're going to be an MBA president, as President Bush said, or others have said, really did try to run the city like he was a CEO mayor. He was very clear about this, and there are very particular interventions he made in the way that city government worked that tried to implement this kind of corporate model. And this goes to sort of nitty-gritty things like how the Economic Development Corporation was organized. It became to be organized like a investment bank, to kind of broader visions of the city. The idea, a quote that I took from Bloomberg that really sort of if I could boil my book down to 8 or 10 words, it would be when he said, hey, we have to look at this city as a product. And if it's a product, it's not Walmart, it's a luxury product. And that's going to drive, he said, and his people said, how we're going to market this city in its competition for investment, desirable residents, and so on. So I think the corporate model was really, was not window dressing. Other people have argued that this was not a real thing. But I really think it did transform the way governance worked, or it was an attempt to transform the way governance worked. This is the third point I want to make before turning it over, is that it didn't really work that well. And the major case study in my book is the Hudson Yards project, the far west side of Manhattan, which, as I detail, that was Bloomberg and Dr. Off's baby. They really wanted to get this thing going. They approached it as an investment, and I have, again, if you look through the book, Daniel Dr. Off in particular talked endlessly about how this was a great investment, and it would pay off at this rate of return, and it would do so and so and so and so, just as an investment made by, a private equity manager, which is what Dr. Off would do. Now, there are also issues with this corporate approach that have to do with how things get done. As we know, CEOs tend not to be sort of small d Democrats. They don't like discussion, they like to give orders. And this makes sense given the organization of a corporation. But of course, cities work very differently. And so that was another major problem, because as we know, New Yorkers don't necessarily march in line with what people tell them to do. And I think there was a real sense among Bloomberg and his close aides that the way things should work is that Bloomberg would come up with a solution to a problem, and it should be given a chance to work. And the Hudson Yards plan, he felt, was a solution to several problems. The state of the far west side, the need for more jobs in the city, the need for tourists, developing the tourist economy, the need for the Olympics, and all the kind of supposed benefits that would generate. So this was something that he and his folks had really decided was for the good of the city as a whole, in their judgment. And they were really quite taken aback, I think, when other people didn't agree. And of course, other people did not agree. And as those of us who were aware of that know, there was a long fight. And of course, the plan did not work out exactly the way Bloomberg had intended. Parts of it have been implemented, parts of it were not. So this is the kind of last point I want to make, is that when we look at the sort of trajectory of the Bloomberg administration, I think there's an important point at which he realizes, he's not he's an intelligent man, as are the people around him, that he would have to accommodate himself, that the corporate model, while still inspiring his governance, needed to adapt to the realities of New York City politics. And the realities of New York City politics are that there are constituencies that need to be satisfied, that horse trading works, and so on and so forth. So I think there was a real kind of way in the middle of the Bloomberg administration, when he was at his most popular, that he adapted himself to the realities of New York City politics. That corporate model had to soften a bit, and as I said, adapt. What's happened since then, I'm going to leave for later, because I don't want to take up too much time. But again, I just want to emphasize that I think this was a really ambitious and transformative vision of what New York City governance could be. That it didn't fail completely, I think, or I should say, it didn't succeed completely, but it clearly has had a major impact on the way people think about governance in New York City. There are things that are thought of as normal now that weren't 12 years ago. The New York Times 12 years ago said the businessman mayor model can't work in New York City. Of course, we know 2-3 years later, the New York Times was, praising Bloomberg to the skies. So I think it really, it hasn't worked all the time, but it has transformed how we think about governance and what kind of models are available and thought of as normal. No, thanks.
I got one.
Actually, Julian, could you just tell us the full title of your book, please?
Yes, it's Bloomberg's New York Class and Governance in the Luxury City.
So, I don't know where to begin. I agree with the class, I would call it class warfare Bloomberg model. And I think much of what Bloomberg, I'm in a permanent state of rage over the Bloomberg mayoralty. And so let me explain from a different angle of vision where I'm coming from. When I thought about what I wanted to say tonight, I thought I might begin with trying to answer a question that a gay activist asked me when he heard that I was just finishing a book about Bloomberg. He said, "Why Bloomberg? He's going to be gone in a couple of years." And answering that question, which I thought the answer to was obvious, is really kind of what I'd like to do tonight. Bloomberg is everything that Occupy Wall Street is fighting against. We have the third most segregated school system in the United States. We have in the New York City school system depending on how you count, the 5th or 10th largest police force in the United States. There are 3 million some odd poor people living at a poverty level, which the standards of which are about 23,000 and change for a family of 4. There are 900,000 people living on 10,000 and change for a family of 4. There are 1.1 million people who pay half their income in rent and have $30 per household for every other necessity of life. This city has been transformed in a much more radical way. I'm a born and raised New Yorker. So this isn't a kind of a law of nature that people can't afford to live here. Bloomberg set out to develop luxury city, a government of, by, and for rich people. And his impact, in my view, the most corrupt and the most dominant political figure in New York's history. Corrupt is not the same as illegal. He probably, what he did was borderline legal. But when he set out to become mayor, in 2000, he quintupled his philanthropic activity and directed it towards grassroots organizations in the 5 boroughs and amongst every ethnic group. So Asian Americans got a piece, African Americans got a piece, Hispanic Americans, people on Staten Island, broad range, over $100 million, 5 times more than he had given the year before. He basically bought every civic and many religious organizations and cultural organizations in the city. And how you can examine that, you started at the beginning, I'll start from the back end. The third term slogan was progress, not politics. That's the Bloomberg represents a very different governance model. It's not the wealthy influencing government that we've had forever. It's the richest man in New York and a small group of people. Also, there are 57 billionaires according to the census, I guess, in New York, virtually controlling the policy and the politics of the entire city. So when he decided, before he decided to overturn term limits, which the city council had been trying to do since it was enacted in 1993, Giuliani wouldn't sign the bill because he was going to run against Hillary Clinton. Bloomberg, and there would be no benefit for him to sign the bill, to referendum, which established two term limits for every New York political official, elected official. Bloomberg when approached with that idea by the city council, said, New Yorkers have voted twice for term limits. This was in 2005. We have to learn to live with it. I think the city council may have the right to do that, but I would call it disgraceful if they do. Then when he couldn't get on the national ticket, he decided to overturn term limits. And all the shtum and drang about the city council, whether it was going to happen or whether it was a done deal, that was all political theater. Bloomberg and Quinn and the other people who wanted to extend their terms just went ahead and did it, and they're there now. And they had the support from very early on. The New York Times, when Bloomberg first ran, had a tepid editorial position in support of Mark Green. But a 1,400-word piece by Bill Keller, the son of a former Chevron oil chairman, was an ode to Bloomberg. What's wrong with a billionaire who wants to give something back becoming mayor of the city? When Bill Keller became the executive editor of the Times in 2003, the New York Times, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., every mainstream media, the real estate developer who owns the Daily News, what's his name? Zuckerman. Yeah, Zuckerman, and Murdoch all backed Bloomberg, and they backed him every term, and they backed him in the most interesting ways. It wasn't the editorial support so much. It was the coverage. When Bloomberg ran for the third, after overturning term limits, he ran, what the New York Times did was publish, he was running against a black man, William Thompson, the controller, and what the New York Times did was publish a front page, top of the fold photograph of Bloomberg treating Colin Powell to a hot dog at a fast food joint. They did many things like that. The civic groups that supported him, he basically bought the city. And what perhaps is the most revealing of all, I'm old enough to remember, and I'll give Al Sharpton his props, when he marched and was stabbed in the chest when he went to Howard Beach and Bensonhurst and black areas that had beaten or killed black people, and faced down the shouts of "nigger go home" and was stabbed in the chest. His patented chant was "no justice, no peace." Well, you haven't heard that during the Bloomberg regime. In fact, what Bloomberg said about Sharpton was that he is my favorite civil rights leader. And the reason for that is very clear. Bloomberg paid Sharpton, the National Action Network, which Sharpton runs, well over $1 million through various mechanisms. And when he decided to run for a third term, Sharpton said, I'm still leaning towards a referendum. That's the day that Bloomberg announced. A week later, 60,000 more came in over the transom. Sharpton stopped leaning. He put vast amounts of money into the Abyssinian Baptist Church, run by Calvin Butts, the successor to the Adam Clayton Powell famous Abyssinian Baptist Church. He put millions of dollars of his private money and leveraging it with government money into the Abyssinian Real Estate Development Fund, which Butts runs. He bought the Republican Party, lock, stock, and barrel, when Pataki and D'Amato ran it and became its #1 financier. He bought the Independence Party. And then when they provided the margin of victory in its first race, he paid them with government, our money, he paid them for various, it's all documented in my book. The dollar a year, I'll finish in a minute. I'm anxious to get an exchange here, but the New York, when I began talking to people about this, how many people know about the payments to Bill Thompson's wife? All right. Bill Thompson, the candidate who was running against Bloomberg, his wife ran, maybe still does, an unaccredited African American museum, a project. It wasn't a museum, totally unaccredited. It was a warehouse somewhere. She received millions of dollars from Bloomberg's private foundation and tens of millions of dollars during the campaign, and tens of millions of dollars before the campaign from the government. And the New York Times never printed a word of it. It was on the front page of the Village Voice. I have yet to find anybody who's even aware of that fact. So there's a long string of stuff. Basically, the difference between influencing government and being the government is a new governance model. We have never had a government like this. And so while people, last point I'll make, while Bloomberg went on and arrested hundreds of thousands of people on bogus trespassing and marijuana charges, mostly black and Hispanic young kids, the black leadership, and I'm not singling them out because they were every civic group went into the tank. When we try to start a little newspaper to oppose this, I asked Nat Hentoff and just old friends, Ira Glasser, who used to run the American Civil Liberties Union. We put out a little newspaper. I asked a very large civic organization for a little help. We were spending our own money. They said, Neil, our hearts are with you, but he's got us by the balls. So that, in effect, sums up the Bloomberg regime, and it's long-lasting. The changes he's made with very tricky real estate transactions that we don't have time to get into have locked in developer subsidies for 20 and 30 years with a thing called payments in lieu of taxes. So that these tax breaks that real estate developers have gotten are locked in. They will never be raised. No future legislature will raise them for 25 years. He's made long-lasting, deep, and very ugly changes in the city, in my judgment.
Neil, could you tell us the title? The title of your book was Mike with an exclamation mark.
Wall Street's mayor.
Okay. Thanks. Jeanne?
It's interesting. I came back from being away a week in Europe, and there I was at 5 in the morning waking up, and by whatever time it comes on, Squawk Box, if you've ever seen it on TV, where they go over the markets and interviewing people. And one of the announcers is talking to some, somebody's interviewing some analysts, and what do you think of this, Occupy Wall Street stuff, the 1-year anniversary? And the way he even asked the question was very disparaging. And the analyst is going, oh, it's had no effect. It's had no effect. It doesn't mean anything. Okay. Fast forward, after hearing a few comments like that, I'm catching up on the news, so I'm, one of them, I get on the computer, and it's the New York Post, and of course they have a sarcastic article about Occupy Wall Street. And I read between the lines of our media and what's going on, and how it is part of the problem also. And the thing is this, let's go backwards to where Occupy Wall Street came from, and the fact that the Wall Street and bank implosion and meltdown, and what's happened since then, and how few reforms we've been able to get, and what a struggle it is to change things. We may not have derivatives upon derivatives upon derivatives trading right now, but we still haven't fixed a lot, and it's a long way to go. But then, I've been saying this for a while, you have to look in your own backyard. And while this is all going on in Washington at national levels, what's going on in New York, what we consider a very progressive, the tourists love to come here. We've had the Stonewall riots, we have a history, the beatniks, Greenwich Village, and so on. Great history over hundreds of years of change, but look in your own backyard and where we are now. And what we have is right in front of our face. It wasn't hidden derivatives and things that weren't listed on exchanges and were done in off-market trading. This is happening in front of us, and I keep on using the word corruption, and I wish I could find a better word, and I can't. I've even looked up on the computer and said, let me find a better word. It's legalized corruption. And what is the balance that you have between the process, the public process of land use process, a big scale plan that comes through like NYU that just came through, or Atlantic Yards, that has to be balanced with the political and influence side of it and development needs. That balance, and through hundreds of years we've gone back and forth, but we are so out of balance right now that, you know, I just sometimes, my mouth is open that I've never seen anything like this in all my years of community activism as a volunteer. And being chair of the community board, zoning committee in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were huge developments. And you looked at the bureaucratic process, and a lot of people would say, you know, that process is so long, it's so involved, it's, you know, I don't even understand it. You have 30 days to do this and 60 days to opine on that. But what I understood by being on community boards and, you know, coming from in the 80s, a corporate world, I was on Wall Street, the whole bit, so I've seen the other side. But what you start realizing is when, you know, I remember a few older people who have passed away now would get up at a local community board and they'd be ranting and raving, and you'd be like, oh God, can we go home and get over this meeting? But the more I was forced to stay there and listen, the more you start realizing why this process works, because it allows the project to evolve, the process to involve everyone. Ideas come out of it. It's like Bloomberg and many of these city council people you may think are so smart. It doesn't mean they always have all the answers. And those answers come from the people, from the process. And right now we have a process that is a game that's being played. And the game is let the people speak, make a lot of noise, make them feel like they've been heard, and we're going to do whatever we damn well want to do anyway. And going through that process and knowing that 2 years ago on NYU as an example, and we're all saying, you know, we have to go through this, but this is a done deal. And when we saw city council vote, no one was allowed to abstain or vote no, is what we were told. One city council person voted no. And everybody said, well, Charles Barron, and everybody said, well, don't worry about him, he never goes along with the crowd anyway. But all these people who are running for office next year, we're gonna have a huge amount of people running for office, public advocate, mayor, controller, on and on. All those people in city council wanna run for those offices. You would think they'd wanna vote no or abstain, because, you know, I have to go to those people in that part of New York to get support and votes next year. But why wouldn't they abstain? Because they were told they couldn't. Why couldn't they? Because the speaker, Christine Quinn, has discretionary funds. Those discretionary funds get doled out to every city council person in their district. Now, what happens if you voted against their wishes? Your funds get pulled. You have to go to your senior citizens and say, we can't put in that new handicap access ramp because I voted to abstain or voted no against a project in New York City and you're in Brooklyn. And, you know, people say, what can I say to my constituents when I'm being held by the money? Now, you know, and the money goes up the chain because we know what the relationship is here now. Between the speaker and the mayor's office. But what we have is a benevolent dictatorship, is what I call it. And the money is running the system. It's running the not-for-profits who all showed up at term limits hearings, and on and on. And you know, we looked at NYU, and all the major real estate developers are sitting on the board of NYU. Bloomberg's co-founder of Bloomberg is the head of the Board of Trustees on NYU. When you talk about Occupy Wall Street in the top 1%, NYU is the top 1% in their highest in contributions to lobbyists for elected officials, along with many of, and they're on their board sit some of the biggest contributors to political campaigns. So NYU is one example, but then you look at St. Vincent's Hospital and the quiet that was heard from all the officials on this. And these are our, we have to sustain the city. It cannot be just all the luxury housing coming one after another. To sustain a city, you need the hospitals, you need the diversity, you need the small scale stores as much as you need the big ones. But right now, I think we're at a pivotal point, and I'm not sure where we're going to go, but we have to get people to understand not to lose themselves, not to step away from this process. The next few years are going to be very important, and let me tell you, in the next little over a year, the land use approvals are coming down the pike so fast because they all want to get them in now, before Bloomberg's out of office. So, thank you.
Thank you. The three of you have painted a bleak picture, and hopefully we'll have some happy questions, or just questions which will demonstrate also ways we can go forward, or just questions about how bleak things are. Does anyone have any questions? I can give you the mic if you like, or
no, that's okay. I'll just speak up. As the token libertarian in the room, I didn't hear anything about Bloomberg's nanny statism, which I absolutely loathe. Does
Sure.
anyone have any
Yeah, I'll
thoughts
talk a bit about
it?
that. I mean, I think that, I don't subscribe to the sort of Glenn Beck, everything went downhill after the progressives at all.
He's not a libertarian.
Okay, I know, but I just want to make that clear before I start bashing the progressives. But I think that Bloomberg is part of a long history of rich people, or well-off elite people, wanting to make the lesser orders more like them. This is what part of what I've been reading a book about Central Park. Part of what Central Park was about for elites was having the new industrial, poor, working class have models for proper behavior. So this is a long history of this, and I think that Bloomberg is very much in tune with this idea that the state, in all sorts of ways, is there to shape people and make them better citizens. And of course, in keeping with a particular notion of what that means. And I think that one of the reasons why there is a critique of Bloomberg from the right is he has really rehabilitated the power of the local state, make it much more coherent, particularly in planning and developing issues where it was very fragmented. And I think that if we're going to talk about sort of hopeful things here, I think that this is actually I'm on the left, but Fred Siegel, who Manhattan Institute, and I, he wrote a book very critical of Bloomberg in lots of ways. He's been very critical. That we would have a lot of overlap. And I think this is one of those sort of good things about Bloomberg, is he's, at least temporarily, there's basis for alliances between people who otherwise might not be on the same page. And maybe that's a bad thing, because then, as soon as they get what they want, everyone starts fighting. But I think that that nanny statism is very much a part of this class politics that I would see as really central to Bloomberg's mode of governance.
Well, for me, in a very small way, Bloomberg has been promoting the notion, with the help of the New York Times, that I am a social progressive and a fiscal conservative. The social progressivism, helping poor kids get out of the obesity trap and all of that stuff, is kind of, you may be right about the society of manners that he's trying to advance. Sorry. But I think it's kind of trivial, because when you feel, as he does, that he can impose by executive order or fiat even favorable kinds of things, but at the same time put 600,000 kids, black and Hispanic kids, through the criminal justice meat grinder, that isn't an equation that makes any sense to me. So I think the nanny I'm Bloomberg, and I can do what I want.
Yeah.
is really the mentality. That's all I have to say about that.
No particular comments, just that where our focus should be, I mean, especially since 2008, and the issues that Bloomberg came in to address and, to deal with, whether it's union issues, education issues, and so much time and effort and press, what it does is it pushes us away from the other issues. When you're talking about, everybody can have a conversation about the soda ban at a cocktail party. Or what about banning cigarette smoking in parks? Becomes an issue everybody can talk about, but then no one's paying attention to, well, what happened with the unions? What happened with that surplus budget we had? And, all this Atlantic Yards. Where was that affordable housing? Wait a second, and the only way they're gonna get that affordable housing there is keeping the pressure on, because they'd love to have that component go away and just get the stadium, the whole bit, and hope it goes away. But if we're paying attention to all the other, fighting over a bike lane that, all the small stores on the street, why didn't you ask us first? We would have helped you build it a little bit better. We're not talking about the more important things that we really need to be talking about while Rome is burning.
The kind of nanny state business is a perfect, on the cheap, New York Times liberal, which is what Bloomberg's constituency is because of the coverage of Bloomberg. But they promoted him, for example. Let's get to the real issues. Affordable housing. The way I got into this was that as the head of a tenants association. I didn't want to be part of it. I never went to a tenant meeting. But all of a sudden, 3,000 people in the complex that I live in, Independence Plaza, were faced with a buyout. And we went through 4 years of the Bloomberg administration. We watched him maneuver Stuyvesant Town, which is the largest affordable housing complex in the city. He was totally on the side of Tishman Speyer. We watched the Atlantic Yards. The affordable housing mayor that he had promoted is a total myth. He changed the definition of affordable, and we have lost 200,000 to 300,000 units of affordable housing since Bloomberg has been in office. So, and he controls the political process. New York has always been, there are two hometown businesses in New York, politics and real estate. And when politics became a capital-intensive business, meaning that it costs so much more money to run, the real estate development crowd became completely dominant. I told the tenants to support Bloomberg because the other guy was totally in the bag in terms of affordable housing. I thought Bloomberg didn't need the money. And so but what happened was I very quickly discovered this luxury city idea. Their affordable housing is very low on the agenda, but the propaganda about affordable housing promoted by the media, especially the New York Times, is very high. So it's kind of a world that has been created that, and a lot of myths floating around, and the nanny state business doesn't mean a lot to me, to tell you the truth.
So you seem to be suggesting, Jeanne and Neil, that the nanny state's kind of functioning as a distraction, and yet I think in some ways this kind of the public aesthetics in it so clearly correlates to like a certain class project, right?
Right.
Can I another question?
I just wanted to say, what do you think Bloomberg is going to do next? Because an acquaintance friend of mine was saying he's not convinced that Bloomberg isn't going to somehow run for a fourth term, somehow. And do you think that's out of the question, or?
Well, anybody's guess is as good as anybody's. I doubt it very, very much, but
Yeah, well, I know I would doubt that, but I think what he'll do is sort of there's a couple things he's talked about. I've heard talk about. He started this Bloomberg View thing, which is what is it? It's nonpartisan opinion or something like. It's this contradictory thing where it's a sort of aggressive centrism, which presents itself as non-ideological, but of course is. And then there's also. I've talked, but I haven't investigated it much. There's some connections with the sort of Clinton Global Initiative that he's talked about getting involved in, which then he could, it's like, did New York, he couldn't do the presidency, but he can do the globe. So, I think those are two things. I think he'll remain involved on these levels in politics and shaping opinion. But I think at this point, I also don't think he needs to. There was a real fear among elites after that second term that all the progress from their point of view that Bloomberg had made would disappear. And there was a real sense that they had to get somebody else in, if not Bloomberg, then another sort of far-sighted business leader. And Richard Parsons, who was the former CEO of Time Warner, was the number one candidate until he decided to go to Italy and work in his vineyard. He was the number one candidate, and when that fell through, that's when the third term thing really came into being. And I think that, as I said before, I think the model, the things that folks have talked about, the transformation of the city has been both its, its physical environment, all the things we've been talking about has been really intense. I don't think they need to have Bloomberg anymore. I mean, Kristen Quinn will be kind of a mini Bloomberg with kind of softer edges, and I think that's, this. And I think I'm not as negative about or as pessimistic, I think, as other folks are, but I think that they're clearly. That the way in which this transformation has occurred is pretty long-lasting and has taken hold.
Let me, just a footnote for a second. That when you say what's he going to do, Bloomberg is going to be a player no matter what. Both candidates are crawling across broken glass because he's regarded by this crowd as a straight talker, promoted. It's not so much for his money, for his credibility. They want Bloomberg's endorsement. And he will be busy promoting his legacy. He's got the largest media company. He's the only guy who's hiring. He's got thousands of reporters on the payroll. And he's got television. In New York, for example, he has a television station that used to be the Yankee network. And lo and behold, when Time Warner franchise was up for renewal, they moved him, the only one, from a 3-digit channel to right next to the former Yankee network. So he is very busy promoting. He's just going to cement his legacy as being a great figure in modern political history. That's the mentality, in my view.
I'd like to do one more question, and then actually our original third speaker just arrived, and so please.
Just a brief question. It's a bit of a sidetrack. What is your opinion about the future of housing?
Of
Rent-stabilized.
Rent-stabilized housing. It's up for, in 3.5 or 4 years, it's up for renewal. The idea, I used to be up in Albany. I was counsel to a Senate Republican majority leader. So I kind of know when they're bullshitting people. And the idea was that they would try to reduce the constituency for rent stabilization. It's the third rail in New York politics. But fewer and fewer people are rent stabilized at this point. Whether they renew it or not is a real question. They have to pass a bill to renew rent stabilization. If they do nothing, rent stabilization is finished. So that would be much to the preference of course, the Real Estate Board of New York, which is the large landlord-driven lobbyists. And there isn't a politician in New York who the real estate industry hasn't underwritten, who has a serious chance for citywide public office. They all want the real estate money. So.
Wasn't it a message that the Supreme Court rejected to get involved with that?
No, I don't think so. They didn't take that case. I'm not an expert on housing and rent stabilization issues, but what I do know is that it comes up for renewal in 3.5, 4 years, I think, and getting the bill passed through a Senate Republican chamber, who knows? What they do is they pass what are known as one-house bills. They've been doing this racket for many years. The Assembly Democrats pass a bill which every tenant loves, knowing that it will be killed in the Republican-controlled Senate. And these are one-house bills with lobbyists on both sides. Nobody ever has to leave the office. Don't ever believe that any of the public officials here, no matter what they say, the borough president, Christine Quinn, none of them are going to be tenant-friendly. They will make all these pronouncements, but don't believe a word of it. I've been through this many times.
Thank you.
Can I jump in?
Yes. This is Ndigo.
Hi, I'm sorry for being late. I had to attend a rezoning hearing up in Harlem, where I'm from. My name is Monique Ndigo Washington. I'm the Legislative Director for the Office of Councilman Charles Barron. And I wanted to just piggyback on a couple of things that I've heard this evening so far, and then talk a little bit about what I've experienced and seeing that Bloomberg has done over the years throughout City Council. One is, irrespective in looking at what the state may or may not pass when it comes to protecting us as rent stabilized people, we have to remember that whoever the mayor is in place, they set the people who sit on the rent guidelines board. And that's key to remember, because a lot of times we forget to have conversations with our constituents and people in our community about the powers that any mayor would have once they get in office. And that's why it's so key for us to make sure we hold their feet to the fire when it comes to whatever our needs are. One of the things that I've noticed and seen that has happened while working at City Council that Bloomberg has done is he's put in a number of policies that have affected us across the board. One, some of you may remember the whole Work Advantage program that he undermined, and it was a 2-year program for families who were living in the shelter. It was a program that gave them money to actually pay for their housing. And the Legal Aid Society had to take Bloomberg and the city actually to court to say that you entered a contract and now you reneged on it. So now that's a problem, because so many families are again going to return to Department of Homeless Services looking for some type of relief because the Work Advantage program no longer exists. Then we have something that's really detrimental that's recently passed in the budget, and some of you may have heard of it. Every year around the budget, there's this dance that happens with whether Bloomberg is going to make cuts to the schools, to fire stations, to libraries. Well, the most recent devastating thing that happened was to the daycare centers and daycare providers. Bloomberg and ACS, Administration for Children's Services, came up with an RFP called Early Learn. And the Early Learn, what it has done is actually taken away from different daycare providers who worked for 20, 30, 60 years. There's a group out in Bedford-Stuyvesant, House of the Lord Church. They have been in existence for a number of years and now find themselves not getting a contract renewed. And why is that problematic? It's problematic because we're looking at the contracts. That's one of the things that Bloomberg has done, is privatizing the contracts and putting us, our public dollars, and turning it over to private hands. So these are some of the things that we have to look at that he's done to undermine daycare centers, Early Learn program. He's undermined with the Board of Education. We see that a number of contracts, whether it was with the school aid workers, one of the most important things that we see is the contracting. When you look at the budget, in that division of contracts, that's the only area that increased. So here we're saying that we have less money to go around, but in your budget in the Department of Education, which by the way is actually the highest budget out of the $68 billion that we have, it's like $24 billion. And then if y'all remember, going back to Kathy Black, one of the things that Bloomberg wanted to do was put and make this person who ran a business in control of 1.1 million students. And so these are some of the things that I think is just kind of, key that I wanted to follow up on and make sure that we keep and be aware of what Bloomberg has done so that we can also think about the future, whatever the next mayor is going to be.
The bleak picture continues. Another question?
This is really for the panel. Just if you can look beyond the horizon, we have the extremes on, the 1% rich and the rest of the 99%, basically a de facto fiefdom. At what point do we get to that tipping point which really will put New York into a very precarious position with respect to, let's be blunt about it, social unrest? It's happened in a number of major cities in first world countries. If you can provide a scenario, what that tipping point will be and basically how that will play out.
Well, just let me say, this guy is an Occupy Wall Street arrestee. So I applaud him because it takes a lot of courage to get out there and take an arrest and go to jail. So the tipping point, who knows? When the stuff we're at the point now where in my lifetime, I'm 74 years old, I have never seen anything like the New York Police Department and penning in demonstrators and barking police dogs. The anti-Iraq demonstration in 2003, penning people in and promoted in the New York Times as a kumbaya event. There people were, or the RNC a year later, where 1,800 people were arrested for peaceful protest. Those are the kinds of things that go on in poor Black and Hispanic neighborhoods every day. The cops have been given pretty much a free rein, and so who knows when the tipping point comes.
Yeah, I wanted to just say, I think that this isn't going to answer your question exactly, but I think the trajectory is important. When Bloomberg came in, culturally and ideologically, we were a society that were worshiping CEOs. You were supposed to be the CEO of your own life, of your own family. Those CNBC tickers were everywhere. People would write about sort of the financialization of everyday life. Everyone was talking about their stock investments. That's gone, right? What we have now is a case where I think a lot of that kind of stuff has been stripped away. And now what we have is sort of a resigned sense of, they're screwing us, but that's kind of the way it is. And I see this among my students. They know they've done everything they're supposed to do, but they still have $60,000 of debt and no job. And I'm kind of like, well, why aren't you, down? Why are you taking a course on Occupy Wall Street with me? You should be, down there doing it right now. But I think now where that goes, one doesn't know. If people have nothing to lose, then that makes unrest more, or certain types of political action much more appealing. On the other hand, if people just feel cynical, and I think, of course, one of the things that Occupy Wall Street did was really give voice to a lot of people who weren't quite sure how to voice their feeling of that something had gone wrong, that the deal had not been kept up, but they weren't quite sure how. And a lot of that has to do with the way in which there weren't credible political alternatives for a long time. Communism, socialism, all that stuff was supposed to be dead. So one of the things that Occupy Wall Street did is say, hey, there are alternatives. And I think that if that, it's sort of obviously the fact that there's been sort of a lull, at least in the public face of Occupy Wall Street, makes a difference. But I think now that's coming back a bit with the anniversary. So who knows?
I think that we are seeing and living the whole tipping point. And if we are able to have conversations with Occupy Wall Street, we know that they have been divided up into different groups and they're focusing on different areas and social justice issues. But to me, the issue has to be connected to electoral politics. There's just no way to get around that. And unfortunately, when people are organizing, we're so mad and frustrated at the system that we don't believe that once you become part of the system as an elected official, that things will change. And our mistake is that we don't send candidates. We don't decide and think that, well, that person has worked with us, that person has worked with us, so we know what that office can do, whether it's a city council member, a state, or congressperson, and so we want to make sure that we hold you accountable to what we want to see done in our community. So I would like to see people really be focused on 2013. Do y'all realize what can happen in 2013? We have 51 council members. 22 of them we become open seats. So that means that there is a window of opportunity for change to occur. I started something called Take Back Our City. Take Back Our City is saying two important things. One, when it comes to gentrification and development, I know we were talking about housing when I came in, one of the things that we find that developers are able to get away with when they look and come into communities is that the ULUP process calls for community members to vote on whether or not they want this project, right? The problem is we're only advisors. So what Take Back Our City is saying, we need to change the city charter to grant community boards the power to vote on zoning and land use. Because in 1989 with the charter revision, we saw that the change shifted from the Board of Estimate and everything and went to city council. So that's one. The second is recall. We need to be able to recall our elected officials. So therefore, now they become accountable to the citizenry as opposed to the real estate developers. You know, and we can't continue to be too afraid to be a part of electoral politics and see that as a valuable answer, especially when we're talking about policy, legislation, and the budget.
And I think it's a time for people, they have to be bold. You know, people in their community who say, well, I don't know how to do that, et cetera, et cetera. People will be forced to be bold. I left a lot of volunteer community. I was running too many committees and everything, needed some time to concentrate on my work. And but you know, I was talking to somebody as I was walking in, you can never get out of it. Once you start getting involved in your community, whatever aspect of it, or education, volunteering, whatever, you're always pulled back. And in 2008, I got pulled back because I was outraged. I saw a lot of the train wreck coming. I just never knew it was going to be so bad. And I was outraged because I knew how much fraud there was, corruption, the greed that was involved, and the lack of moral compass. So what I did is I got re-involved in a group I'd always been a quiet member of, Downtown Independent Democrats. And that's, you know, we deal on issues, but it's also getting people elected and knowing your officials, knowing who your judges are. Now, we need to elect good people. One of the problems is there's not that many people coming up the ladder. We have to get the young people to become a district leader, to, you know, some of these arcane positions very few people know about. A judicial delegate, which goes to a convention in New York City to help get judges elected. We need to get all of us, no matter what age, involved, because otherwise we have nobody replacing this system that everybody's getting so used to. So it's going to be very important, and you know, groups like ours, we had last year a race with only 4 district leaders and a couple of judges. District leaders, a volunteer position. We got 68 to 72% of the vote for 4 district leaders with hardly any turnout, but those people know what's going on. We need to have a lot more people, and don't forget, Tribeca is an example. The population below Canal Street has increased by 91% since the last census. So we have a lot of people who are not necessarily connected with their neighborhoods. And you know, this is painting the side from the bleak side. What can we do? And you know, people say, oh, you have to be involved. Well, we have to be bold, and we have to make ourselves be involved. Our neighbors have to be involved. We have to force people. You know, I got a bunch of college kids registered. I embarrassed them into it, and now they're going to things up in Oswego on hydrofracking. I'm like, what? Wow, that is so cool. They're going to public hearings on hydrofracking. So once it starts, it's a snowball for good reasons.
So can I just add one thing too, as we leave today, if we can research, because I don't know how many people are aware of, you know, we're currently going through a redistricting of city council lines. So the lines have been temporarily redrawn, and they're coming around in October with another round of hearings. So you can go on the website and look at and see where your community is now, the boundaries, and then look at what the commission is saying that the lines could possibly look at, and be a part of that discussion. People should be engaged in saying, that you were talking about, if the population has changed or shifted, you want to make sure that your voice is heard and that you are a part of the process.
Any last questions before we close things up?
How do you think we can support more Occupy Wall Street? I think it's a movement very important.
Say again?
Occupy Wall Street movement was a very important movement that actually confronted Bloomberg. Right in front of the face, in front of their home.
Yeah.
And now it's sort of kind of diluting, and of course, I mean, Bloomberg has been responsible for that, and the media, and how can we be really involved in this movement?
First you have to understand that the 1%, are very worried about Occupy Wall Street. They take it very seriously. The history of all social movements, as I understand it, have this ebb and flow. They are hoping this thing goes away, and they are trying to make it go away with their coverage. So, for example, I don't march or do stuff like that, but my wife and I marched with communication workers 1180 on May Day. There were tens of thousands of people who marched from Union Square down to the financial district. It took us 2.5 or 3 hours chanting, hey, hey, Wall Street mayor, gotta go, blah, 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 blah. It was a powerful demonstration. The next day, the New York Times reported May Day in Moscow. That was the photograph. They did not report it. So this is going on every day. You've just, this is the most, in my mind, the most important movement. You don't have to be pepper sprayed or get arrested like this guy, but you ought to be doing something. And I don't, you should have an answer to that one. How do people get involved in Occupy? Because that is much more important, in my mind, than anything else that can happen.
And can I just add, it's not just Occupy, because there's connections through all this. When we had NYU, a town hall last January, the Occupy people who are in the area were there saying, we support you because we understand what's going on with land use issues, and that NYU is making a land grab for land that our forefathers had said you can never have this because you're allowed to do something else. So there's many different connections through your local civic associations, community boards, council member town halls, and keep your ears alert, because the media is not our friend here. And you know, even downtown newspapers have just been bought up by the wife of a Murdoch executive, News Corp. Now, that may mean nothing, but just you keep your eyes open to things like that, but just stay connected somehow, some way through associations, because we're all connected to Occupy Wall Street in many ways.
I'm not. I wish I were. Well,
The thing is that
I wish they were here too.
there's such a
Young people.
there's such a large
They're getting bailed tonight, from what I heard about the arrest today.
there's such a large kind of alternative media sphere, which has its pros and cons. That because of this kind of lack of coverage, and partly I think part of it may be intentional or ideological, but it's also just the way the news works. You know, if you blow up some people one day, then it's news, but if you blow up the same number of people, you know, every week, it's not news. And so similarly, if you have some huge protests, it's news, but if they're going on all the time, it's not covered. So in some ways, that's just how the news works. But then also there's now, I mean, particularly, I mean, the internet, there's just this whole alternative news sphere, which if one's tapped into it, they have access to it, and there's all types of things going on. The problem is that if one's not tapped into it, then one doesn't know what's going on. But I mean, the other thing, I could go on and on about Occupy. It's like really interesting and weird and puzzling and has a lot of problems, I think. But one thing to take into account is how many organizations, which have very old organizations, have kind of been recast and sometimes are appropriated by Occupy. So it's not a coincidence, for example, some of the most successful groups, at least in New York, are Occupy Faith, which is basically different religious organizations which were already there, and then they're progressive churches and synagogues or whatever, and they take up the Occupy flag. And so those institutions, and particularly the social networks, are already there. And in contrast, some of the groups, kind of smaller informal groups, it's a lot of work because one of the big problems with Occupy is that it's highly charismatic. So there's this constant reinvention, people doing new things, creating new groups, and there often lacks a kind of substantial base that keeps people together, despite the fact that even though with the camp gone, people were worried that once the camp was gone, it would fall apart, but it hasn't, because those networks were already built, and then one kind of gets into them electronically, and then personally, I've met so many people that I would never have met, and so.
Can I just ask, do you think there's any chance that some Occupy people will join community boards and get into the political process? Like that could, what you were saying, and you're all saying that it's political, and that, if these are very active people, the Occupy people, maybe some of them can kind of, get into the political process. Does anybody have any comment about that?
I think that's true. I mean, I also would, my understanding of the Occupy movement is that there aren't Occupy people. There are like occupations. So if you want to get in the Occupy movement, you can occupy something. So, a bunch of anthropologists who are mad about the way that the professional anthropology organization works in regard to the vast majority of our colleagues, many of our colleagues who are low-paid adjuncts but still have to pay lots of money to come to the, do the things that, Adam knows academics have to do to advance their careers and make a living, started making a stink about it and showing up at executive board meetings and put a table in the meetings and said, we're occupying anthropology. We have an Occupy Montclair State, where students did the same thing. So, you should pick something important to you, and that one of the great things about the language and the tactic and the kind of the appeal of it, the use of posters, there's all sorts of things, is that they are completely, you can use them, wherever. It's not a kind of movement like where you get a card. It's a franchise. Exactly, that's a great example.
A set of practices and certain terms and ideas, and they're easily transposable, which explains why, in some ways, it's success, because it's so simple.
Yeah, there are people, I know quite a few people who are connected to Occupy Wall Street, and so we've been talking about ways to connect, because when you look at Occupy Wall Street movement, that has been said, you have to remember it did break up into different fractions as well. So some people just connected to social justice movements that were already taking place and say they attached themselves to that, which is great because it showed that they weren't just a one-time show, one pony show and then gone tomorrow, but decided, well, there are different things for me to be connected to. So answer to your question is I believe that there absolutely is room for people as long as we have to be clear and be able to show, in my opinion, how being a part of electoral politics is going to transform and bring some type of change. Because if not, then we'll just continue to be upset and saying those people are in place and, and have marches without doing both.
I think the tipping point question is the real issue, because I don't have any faith in electoral politics anymore. I don't think it works. We have 80%, 75% of the people who want Medicare, who don't fool around with my Social Security, don't fool around with my Medicare. We had overwhelming number of people angry at Bloomberg's third term. They just rode right over it. And we don't hear a discussion, on television. Rarely do you hear a discussion about the wealth disparity. You'll hear about entitlements, we've got to do tax reform, but you don't hear wealth disparity. You don't see Occupy very much on television. So we're living under a very close to, what else to call it but an oligarchy.
Last
October, I went to my first street demonstration for Occupy. And this is where Google is your best friend. If you want to get to know more about Occupy, try your Google search terms, because, you know, I was, other than being a voter, a regular voter, a registered independent, I never went to a street march, and it's amazing. Mass media is not the friend of Occupy, and it never will be, and that's just the way it is. But if you go out onto social media and you use Google as your friend, you would be amazed at what's out there. And you do. You could pick, I'm part of Occupy Yoga in Union Square. I'm part of Occupy NYU. I mean, it really is, Occupy is a very broad term. It doesn't have to be throwing eggs and garbage on Wall Street, although you're certainly welcome to do that. But, you know, and you don't have to get arrested, because I certainly wasn't harassed and arrested. Might have been because I was a white, you know, highly educated female. I don't know. But, you know, I feel like that there's safety in numbers.
So we're ending with optimism, actually. After all the, what do you have? One last question, sir?
You're talking to me?
Yeah.
Yes, I think you overlook two really major movements right now. Stop and frisk. You're not addressing that at all.
Oh.
Except for this gentleman here. There's been massive demonstrations on Fifth Avenue, from 110th Street down to Mayor Bloomberg's mansion, and they're very angry. And that's something that our news media doesn't cover. The 9/11 architect and engineer report on the truth of 9/11, that's not being reported. It's been reported only once by public.
Right, in Colorado.
In Colorado.
Mind-blowing.
Yes.
Mind-blowing. I'm not a conspiracy guy, but that was a mind-blowing report.
And none of the media, BBC, National Public Radio, only one public station in Colorado published that video, and it's very powerful. And it makes me very angry, because it's got so much circumstantial, conclusive evidence that was an inside job by our government.
Well, it didn't say by our government. It was definitely the planes didn't take those buildings down. Believe me, if you watch this video, this report by Colorado Public Television, I saw the second plane hit. I was 5 blocks away. That was a controlled demolition, and there are thousands of engineers and architects. I know we're off the subject, but believe me, that was extraordinary.
Just one comment. We're not a big crowd here, and I think it might be partially because it's Jewish New Year. So this, you know, it's not a good date. Because I think for me this was very educational, because you're really showing what's going on behind the scenes, which I'm fairly educated. I read newspapers, I watch news, but things that you mentioned today, I don't know.
Right, you wouldn't.
And
You're
I
not
think
supposed
we
to
have
know.
to figure out a way that public, you know, we're facing elections. The public needs to get more educated.
And you know, I was just in England, and I was explaining, people were asking me what's going on downtown New York, and I was going over NYU and some of the other things that have been voted on. And there are people, somebody whose father was mayor of a town some years ago, and he said, this can't be true. That can't be happening. How can it work that way? And they were stunned. They said that wouldn't happen here. It doesn't mean there's not corruption over in there, but they could not believe our process of the money, the influence, overriding all the public processes of how our government is set up to work and isn't working. So it was kind of interesting. What could I say?
On a final note, actually, another thing we can, kind of a local issue which has been mentioned in passing, but just to keep in mind is, and I mean, the reason why I'm here today is because Mark Crispin Miller wasn't able to do it, and he asked me, but I know Mark, I mean, we both work at New York University, but I know Mark from working in the group Faculty Against the Sexton Plan. So if you have the time and the energy, a local issue, I mean, it's gone through the kind of the legal realm, and it'll go to there's a lawsuit, but there's also kind of extra legal things, certain kinds of resistance we can show within the community to the NYU expansion, if anyone wants to participate in that. I'd like to thank our speakers and also the bookstore. Buy a book, or buy their buy 2 of their books actually.